If you're not in AI, why the hell not?
The question that every founder should be asking themselves is there a way that AI makes my startup more effective?
Next question.
In the very early days of a company, you don't really have a brand. What you're able to do is have a message.
You should be working on developing a brand, a name, a visual identity, a promise in the world.
There are plenty of examples of really ugly logos and stupid names that have become massively successful.
I think in a world where you have synthetic intelligence, artificial intelligence looking after the composition of information, math, new breakthroughs in thinking, what our kids need to learn is how to think and how to adapt, and how to use these tools ethically. The experience of being a human and the social and interpersonal aspects of being a human.
There's something a little bit also dystopian about the idea of each child being individually nurtured by an AI teacher. An important role of schooling, we mustn't forget, is to socialize people.
Next question.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode. In-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein. And in today's episode, we have a fantastic bunch of listener questions that we're answering. What are we advising founders to do in these more difficult times when they're trying to raise money? And is their startup even viable? Why are women finding it harder than ever to raise capital for their startups, even more so than a few years ago? And what is the future of AI in education? Chris and I get into all that and more right after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. All right, let's jump in.
The first question comes from our friend Mark Orchard, who's the CEO of Planet Startup. Hey guys, given the particularly weird market right now, how are you advising founders to approach fundraising in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Like when you say it's a funny market, I think it depends on the stage, right? I think it is sort of defrosting from the bottom up from, pre-seed and seed is sort of moving reasonably well. And then as you go up into Series A and B, it's a bit different. But honestly, Mark, my feeling is that the advice doesn't really change that much. Raise as much as you need to get to the next stage, no more, no less. Now, what happens is it becomes more or less difficult in different environments, but I think it's actually really risky to say, oh, okay, investors are expecting us to be cash flow positive before we raise and bend ourselves to the investors' will. Like Chris, you and I have talked about this before and, the bad things that happen there. So what I actually think, being really direct, the line of viability moves, right? So when you're in a ZIRP, zero interest rate period, there are a lot of startups that are able to raise capital and become viable because of that. Whereas now, if you fall below a certain line, then you may simply not be able to raise. And what that means is you don't have a viable startup. Not right now. Maybe next year you will. Maybe 2 years ago you did. Right now you don't. I really feel like the advice itself as to how to raise doesn't change based on the external environment.
So it's interesting you describe it as defrosting from the bottom up. That's a very evocative and elegant way of saying it. I think it's actually also defrosting from the top down, right? So the public markets are getting very frothy. It's only a matter of time until there's one or two successful IPOs. And of course, that is the off-ramp, the exit ramp for many of these investments, and they need to see those valuations decompressing. So maybe it's decompressing from the bottom and the top, and the middle is going to thaw out. As it relates to the differing advice, I think the one key piece of advice that is more true today than it was before and should continue to be true if we weren't going to go back to frothy land, which we are inevitably going to go, you need to deploy capital more wisely. You need to hire smarter, better people, even if they cost you more money, which is a bit counterintuitive. You need to make fewer rookie mistakes and end up in fewer dead ends and wasted cycles. and you need to be smarter and more ambitious about how you operate and how you think and act in the world. And of course, that potentially means you need coaches, advisors, mentors around you who can help you if you haven't done this once, twice, 3 times before. The other thing is I'm advising founders that I work with to be aware that there's more dumb money with more dumb advice. You mentioned this thing about racing to revenue, racing to profit. I'm sorry, that's dumb advice. Go find smarter investors and focus on scale, focus on growth, focus on solving problems in a way that scales. So don't start chasing big ticket enterprise sales for your barely existent software resulting in technology-backed services companies. It's a controversial bit of advice. The fancy people over at All In talk about default alive and nonsense and whatever. If you're building a Silicon Valley style, venture-backed or backable startup, your goal is growth. Your goal is scale. Your goal is to do things that can scale. It's not to sell massive enterprise deals so that you can get to profitability as fast as possible.
When I talk about viability, Chris, that's what I mean. Because you say, don't take the dumb money, find smarter money. The founder might say, but I can't find smarter money in this market. There's not enough of it around. They're not looking at me. And that's what I mean when I say, well, in that case, the startup as you envisage it is not viable right now. If you need to raise smart money and you can't, then you don't have a viable startup. The solution is not to raise dumb money instead. The solution is to put your plans to one side and do something else, which could be pivoting your startup, doing it differently. Or it could be saying, this is not the right time to start the sort of startup that I want to do. We've talked about being like compromised from the beginning. If you have an idea that requires a sort of high growth mindset, if it requires raising capital and you raise dumb money, it never ends well.
I guess the last bit I would say, and this is not just fundraising advice, but obviously fundraising is pointed at AI right now. And that doesn't mean that you shoehorn AI in. It doesn't mean you find a technology in search of a problem. But good tech at all times is rethinking problems and domains from first principles. And the first principles have changed. There is now large language models. So if you're building a tech startup, I would be asking myself, how does AI rewrite the playbook in this domain? And I would be starting from AI native. And therefore, your startup would qualify for the gold rush, the trend rush into AI, which will make it easier to fundraise. But frankly, it'll put it on the right trajectory, because if you're ignoring AI, you're ignoring a fundamental platform shift and therefore a platform opportunity.
So maybe that's actually a good segue to the next question that Mark asked us. And Chris, you've just relocated to Silicon Valley, so this podcast has become even more Silicon Valley. And based on what you're seeing there, Chris, what are your predictions for startups and tech over the next 24 months?
Yeah, that's right. I've actually just moved back to Silicon Valley after a short stint back in Australia. I've did a report on one of the recent Reacts episodes. I've been doing live stories on my Instagram. So if you don't follow me on Instagram, follow me there. You'll see a live man on the street video of what's going on. But I do think the answer we just gave is very much tapped into this, which is there's obviously smarter money here. They're obviously extremely attuned to the AI opportunity. They're looking for companies who are rethinking problem domains from the ground up using large language models by default, native AI applications. Some of it is frothy and valuations are getting a little crazy. I'm in a back channel right now with one of the top VCs, and he's saying, wow, these guys just raised a crap load of money at a massive valuation with no product. And they've only had one startup in their history and it failed. So he is seeing that deal flow acceleration, those deal terms accelerating. Then again, another friend of mine who shall remain nameless as well, also a top partner at a top VC firm, is saying, actually, we're still looking at deal terms twice, 3 times. We used to turn them around, 3 days now where we're doing a lot of diligence. But I think over the next 12, 24 months, which is your question mark, not question mark, is that things are just going to continue to thaw, I think. I think there'll be a continued acceleration. FOMO is going to start creeping back in. It's the typical, bang and bust cycle, guys. Yaniv, you and I at the very beginning of the downturn said, this is just a cycle. It's going to thaw again. Focus on your startup, focus on scale, focus on growth. The next 12 or 24 months is going to be a resumption of normalcy, and people are going to be moving fast to capture these opportunities. Continue to focus on scale, continue to focus on venture outcomes, and continue to deploy capital wisely, continue to get good advice, and avoid making mistakes, because the highest cost is opportunity cost.
I think that the real question here, Chris, is about AI, right? Because I think what we have is, you said, there's a thaw, but it's a bit of a 2-speed economy in startups at the moment, right? There's AI and there's everybody else. And it's nearly like AI has gotten back to some of those silly 2021 types of operating where like you said, failed founder, not there's anything wrong with failing, but, founder with no successful exits behind them, raising massive seed rounds or pre-seed rounds, pre-product. And of course, the risk of that, we've spoken about before, is you tie yourself into a very high valuation. If you don't know what to do, you overspend, you're not able to raise the next round and up valuation, you become a zombie. So the previous question that Mark asked about the advice we give to founders is be disciplined, right? It's the same whether things are really hot or really not. So yes, AI makes it a much easier place to raise. The question is, what is the environment like if you're not in AI? And also, if you are in AI, how do you not get caught up in the frothiness and have the discipline to build a startup that can go the distance? It's very clear right now that AI is a technological wave. All the smart people are betting on it. It is still a bet. It doesn't necessarily pay off, but it's a good bet. And so that does feel like it's where the action is going to be for at least the next 12 months, if not much, much longer.
Well, I'm saying something a little bit more pointed than that, which is if you're not in AI, why the hell not? Like, why are you not in AI? Whatever problem you're working on, think about what the AI native solution to that is. You should be in AI, irrespective of the domain you're in. There must be a way to sprinkle in some AI. And I don't mean in a kind of craven or cynical or superfluous way. I'm saying it is likely AI should be playing a meaningful role in the domain or a problem you're trying to solve. It's likely. It's not 100% certain, but it is likely. So look for that and find a way to get into that in that groove. It's very valuable and like critical platform shift that happens only once every 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Look, yes, but I think your advice can easily be misinterpreted, even though you put that caveat in at the end. When you say, why aren't you in AI? There are still plenty of opportunities outside AI. And the question that every founder should be asking themselves is there a way that AI makes my startup more effective, right? There is this very powerful new tool. I should be looking very deeply as to the applications of that tool. But anything about sprinkling AI in or kind of distorting the product that you should be building because you want it to be more AI-ish, I would actually warn against. I think that can cause some really bad outcomes.
Absolutely. Taste, judgment, deep introspection. Don't screw up what you're doing, but really think seriously about why.
Do you remember when everything had crypto? Now, I'm not saying that AI is like crypto because, I think crypto was clearly grifty from pretty early on. But the idea that's like, oh, okay, we've got this great product idea. Let's put it on the blockchain. But what is the user benefit, right? It's like, you don't want that.
Yeah, AI is just fundamentally different to blockchain. I think if it was something else, right? If it was blockchain or SaaS or, the new Vision Pro, I would not be speaking in such definitive, prescriptive terms. AI fundamentally reshapes the entire world and every domain. So I'm speaking only about AI, and it is, as I said, highly likely whatever you're working on is meaningfully changed by AI. Next question. Toby Tank, who is building partnerships at Salient, asks, looking at the Q2 report figures, looks like a bit of a drop-off in funding for female founders since the start of the year, despite an uptick in deal incidents and money spent generally. Any thoughts as to why? Should this be discouraging, or is it too small a data set to be meaningful and statistically relevant? So just to summarize that very quickly, there seems to be a drop-off in investment in female founders. So the question is that meaningful? Is the data relevant? And what should we make of it?
To answer this question well, I feel we should have some folks from the VC industry represented. It is discouraging. It is also a very small data set. And the problem is, yes, if we've gone from female founders being funded in high single-digit percents and now it's low single-digit percents, that could be noise. The problem is it's in the single-digit percents. And, we had an episode not that long ago, Chris, about DEI, when there was this guy who was like pushing the sort of meritocracy and positioning it against DEI. And I think that it's problematic that we don't have more female founders being funded. It's not for want of trying. I think what is true is if you look at the industry, there are more female VCs, more VCs that have programs encouraging female founders than ever before. So I think while it can be easy and glib to virtue signal and gnash our teeth and whatnot, I think that the question that I don't have an answer to, but is the one that needs to be asked is, what is the root cause here? And not default to sort of easy answers or answers that just sort of fit an existing narrative, but actually to understand what are the obstacles and what should the right number be. I think it's also easy to say the right number should be 50%, but I don't know. We've talked before about pipeline and so on, and what sort of people want to become founders. And It's an interesting question. I think it's a difficult conversation to have, especially as a couple of blokes here, because it can be easy to be seen as dismissive of what's clearly a real problem. But I do think that fitting into simple narratives where we're like, oh, okay, it's too low and it's bad, and therefore we just need to, it's systemic bias in the system and we just need to fix that. Yes, there are systemic biases, but there needs to be more in order to actually solve the problem rather than to virtue signal and to sort of look like we're trying to solve the problem.
Obviously, it sucks that more high quality women are not being funded based on their merits. That is a real problem. But I always push back on things like, well, we're two blokes and who knows if we can discuss this. Well, we're two people who discuss all sorts of things. We're just as qualified to talk about it as anybody else. And no, I don't want to virtue signal on this podcast. I want to talk about hard facts. I suspect, and I have no data or evidence to back this up at all, I suspect, A, it is a pipeline problem. There are fewer female founders out there asking for money, and so therefore fewer founders are going to get funded. That's number one. Number two, I suspect that as the ZERP phenomena ended and people are having what they perceive to be a flight to quality, for most VCs, quality means pattern matching and safe bets. And for most investors with explicit or implicit bias, safe bet means male founder or two male founders. And so implicitly or subconsciously or explicitly, they're kind of like, actually, we don't have money to waste here on DEI crap. Let's just bet on the men that we trust. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's fair. I'm not saying that it is even in the realm of right or fair. I'm saying that might be a psychological thing that is occurring. I guess maybe another potential phenomena, to go back to the pipeline thing. And again, this is maybe a very controversial thing to say. As budgets are getting tighter, childcare is getting more expensive, part of the family is getting tagged with, hey, you've got to be the carer here, and you don't have a job, and you're the female, and you fall into the carer role, which only makes the pipeline problem worse. Women are less at liberty to go start companies potentially. So again, I have no data on the pipeline. I have no data in the change to the pipeline post-COVID and ZERP. I have no data on how the VCs are making these decisions. These are just stabs in the dark based on the existing cognitive biases that exist, that suck, that are unfair and unhealthy, but maybe that's what's happening.
I would just add to that briefly. I guess you could sort of categorize this as pipeline problem, but there's also a seniority issue. At least you would call it a seniority issue if it were in the corporate world, right? What you've seen in DEI in the corporate world is often what happens is you might get to your headline 50% female workforce, and then you look at the seniority within the organization. And all the top guys are guys, right? Like all the senior partners at the law firm are men, and then all the associates are women and that sort of thing. And yes, it's biased, but it's also, some of it is a hangover of biases from decades ago, right? Because back when the generation of people who are now partners were being hired, then there weren't any women being hired. And so, yes, you can do various things to try to even things out at the top, but that takes even longer to change. And while that remains, that systemic bias is there. And so I feel like, sure, some founders, young kids straight out of school and hungry, but a lot of founders, especially post-ZERP, like you said, Chris, an important way of credentialing yourself to attract funding is to have a track record. And so if more people coming out of big tech, more people coming out of the earlier generation of startups where there was a lack of gender diversity are getting funded more easily, then they are more likely to be men. And so, I think these are not easy problems to solve.
So actually on that, there is data that says that the average age of a founder is getting older, apparently in their 40s now, which may be related to what you're saying, which is they have more credentialing, they have more seniority and experience. And as a hang up of historical bias against women, there are fewer senior or credentialed women that are there, which again goes back to pattern matching and signaling and fear that is now in the ecosystem. And so these are all just blind guesses. Now, here is where our maleness may make us blind to certain facts. We haven't been in these meetings as women and therefore have not heard any direct signal from the VCs. But mostly that signal is probably going to be bullshit anyway, because they're not going to tell you, sorry, we're not going to invest in you because you're a woman. So who knows what the value of that will be. We're taking on more and more controversial topics as the podcast goes on. This is fun.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Flow Health, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, the next question. Nishita Sika, who's the Senior DevOps Engineer at LinkedIn, asks, Yaniv, Chris, I have questions on how to brand your product after the initial MVP. I need your feedback on what I'm trying to build. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it has an inherent misunderstanding built in, which is the question of relaunching your MVP. So this sense of like you build an MVP and then you do some learning and then you relaunch it, or you build an MVP, it has some kind of brand, and then you might change that branding after the launch, sort of implied in the question here that Nishita's asking. My advice and the way I do these things is to consider the MVP is simply just the first version, and you continue to learn, ship new features, and iterate on the MVP. So there is no relaunch and there is no rebrand. As it relates to the branding specifically, your brand and your positioning and your marketing and your website and everything continues to evolve as your product does, from quote unquote the MVP, the first version, to 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3 and 1.4. This is rooted in the fundamental mistake I see so many founders make, which is to build an MVP and then pivot to something else and build another different MVP and then pivot to something else and build another MVP, or build an MVP with the eye to eventually relaunching it or rebuilding it for some reason. That's just not the way to think about it. You have to continue to iterate until it becomes less and less minimum and more viable product.
Let me go down a slightly different road with this question. I think it's complementary to what you're saying, Chris, which is what we really mean by brand. And, big caveat, I'm not a branding expert, but brand is really the perception that people have of your product or of your company when, the associations that they have with it. And so in the very early days of a company, you don't really have a brand. What you're able to do is have a message. People have no idea what your product is. You don't have a brand. And so when you say, how do you brand your product? I would say the most important thing to do is to think about how to make it clear to your customers what your product can do for them, right? Start to build that association of like, what sort of problem do you solve? And sure, you can have a nice logo, you can have a cool name, you can have nice colors. Frankly, maybe later on that becomes an important way of signaling your brand. Early on, there are plenty of examples of really ugly logos and stupid names that have become massively successful, and even more examples of founders who put way too much effort into having brand assets and logos and all that have sunk without a trace. I actually think it's like, yes, your brand is important early on, but not in the way that you might think. It's not about assets. It is about messaging. And in that sense, you nearly wouldn't use the word brand here, right? You would really be thinking about how do you position your product and make it clear what value it is you offer to your customers. And that is an iterative process. Like you said, Chris, in the same sense that an MVP is not something that you launch and relaunch and unlaunch and relaunch again. It's something that you keep testing and learning and refining and improving. That is how you should be thinking about your brand.
Yeah, I have a slight quibble with that. I agree with you. Your brand is your promise, and it is the entire experience people have with you, 100%. And when you launched, you said you don't have a brand. I would argue you don't have a well-known brand. You don't have a promise that is pre-understood. But I would make the slight change to that, which is you should be working on developing a brand, meaning a name, a visual identity, a promise in the world, value props. Many of the things you just listed, I would describe them as brand. And I would be working on a minimum viable brand and a continuous iteration of that minimum viable brand alongside your minimum viable product. So this is not really at conflict with what you said, or just a slight nomenclature difference, I think.
Yeah, I am describing those things as brand. And when I say, yes, you don't have a brand, I guess that is shorthand for your brand currently has no value. Because if it is not a well-known brand, if it's not a known brand, you don't need to worry about that. A brand is something that you get to in the same way as a product market fit is something that you get to. But I think because brands have this sort of visual identity, people can easily focus in on that, which is missing the point. I guess that's really what I'm trying to say. A nice logo and pretty brand colors and, font choices and so on. I know I'm the hairy-fisted engineer here, Chris, and you care a bit more about aesthetics than I do. And I'm not saying that aesthetics has no value, but I think it's often easy to think that the look and feel aspect of your brand is important. Whereas really the logo and all of that is more designed to make sure that once your brand is well known, that people associate that look with that brand promise being delivered. The actual thing that matters is that you make it clear what you offer and then you actually deliver against that. That is the brand. That is something you work and refine. The logo and the name just come along for the ride.
What you're talking about, Yaniv, is I think you have no brand equity yet, right? There's no association with the brand. And you're also talking about the visual identity part of the brand, which is a subcomponent of brand. The logos, the fonts, the colors. That's typically referred to as visual identity. And then you've almost made another point that I want to also make, which is don't let your perception of your brand or trying to protect this thing that doesn't have any brand equity hold you back from a constant evolution of your brand, which is the promise you're making, the value props, and the visual identity. So I want to put a very fine point on this, which is don't get hung up on, well, if I say we do this thing now, then we won't be able to say we do this other thing later. And oh my goodness, we're going to get locked into a certain brand promise. That's a really important thing you're pointing to is do not let your branding, the whole system, promises and everything, get overwrought and feel like you have to get that exactly right day one. Talk about what you practically do with your MVP and evolve it over time, and people will go along on the journey with you. Okay, the last question we have is from Nicholas, who asks, AI will one day be entrenched in schools and education. What would you like to be considered in the education system for your children and your grandchildren? Essentially, how might we suggest the education system change as a consequence of AI? I think the first thing to talk about is not only will AI as a subject or AI as a tool be entrenched in education, but AI will be powering education, right? You can imagine AI teachers, AI coaches, AI tutors. You can imagine incredibly personalized education of the very best standard for every student everywhere. I don't know if that, and I don't necessarily believe that replaces a human teacher and the human touch, but I think it certainly bolsters it and plays an incredibly important role. But I think also that AI changes the nature of what is being educated, the topics that are being discussed. I think certainly regurgitating information becomes a lot less important and interesting. And I think we are long overdue for a reckoning in terms of what is core curriculum. Children going through schools need to be learning much more important things that are historically been called soft skills, that are actually the essential skills of humanity, especially in a post-AI world. Things like the ethical use of power and leadership, emotional intelligence and empathy, critical thinking and problem solving, learning how to adapt, environmental stewardship and financial literacy and mental wellness and ethics. And these things have been relegated to like parents and relegated to unimportant. It's not the core reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I think in a world where you have synthetic intelligence, artificial intelligence looking after the composition of information, math, invention of new science and new breakthroughs in thinking, what our kids need to learn is how to think and how to adapt and how to use these tools ethically and how to maintain their mental health. The experience of being a human and the social and interpersonal aspects of being a human become far, far more important and I think core to education.
I agree, but I don't know if you'd say I'm more cynical or skeptical, but what I have seen over the last, say, 3 decades is the introduction of computer and internet technology into schools. And I would say overall, it has been a massive failure. There are even some elite schools now that are taking laptops back out of the classrooms, tablets back out of the classrooms, and really reverting to a bit more of a pre-technological way of teaching. And honestly, my wife is a school teacher. If I see the way that technology has been implemented in schools, I would say it has been a net negative. It hasn't actually helped educate our children. It has provided a large source of distraction and confusion and whatnot. So, I kind of fear that the same sort of thing. If we're like, we need to put AI into our schools. The issue isn't what can AI do to help educate our children. The question is, given the type of education system that tends to prevail in most countries on earth. So there's something kind of structural about why education systems end up the way that they are. And if we worry about, our children being taught the right things, are they getting the sort of the customization of their education to their needs? I don't think the problem that we've had so far has been a lack of technological capability to enhance that. I think we've had an execution issue. We haven't been able to operationalize that. And so I think AI will kind of be the same. I don't feel positive that school systems as they exist are going to be able to incorporate AI in a way that actually creates a better learning environment for children. If anything, it's just another challenge that needs to be handled. I guess that's what I see. Sure, there's opportunity there, but it's going to be really challenging to take advantage of it.
You are a skeptic, aren't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a skeptic in a different way. When I went to school, and admittedly that was a bloody long time ago now, it occurred to me that school was a very good vehicle for creating worker bees. Stand in line, respond to a bell, learn and regurgitate information, sit quietly, don't be too disruptive or too creative. I'm certain, and I suspect, there has been some evolution in schooling since then, but I suspect it's not as far or as good as it should have been. And I suspect that's a combination of institutional resistance, and this is by design. It's not designed to create leaders who break the world, make a dent in the universe. It's designed to create people who can be productive members of society in a hierarchy. I think a lot of teachers will take issue with what I just said. I'm sure many teachers individually believe themselves to be doing an amazing job working within that system or trying to change that system or have aspirations for the system to be different. I'm not talking to or about teachers. I'm talking about a system. I think the opportunity for AI, though, I just think AI is just a substantively different thing. Computers are tools. AIs are parallel intelligences. And I think right now, that's not quite as apparent as it will be. Right now, AI is a tool. It's a co-pilot. It's a thing that you ask to do something for you. But I think in short order, it's going to start thinking for itself. And I think that it will play an incredible role of doing what many teachers aspire to do, which is giving highly personalized, highly empathetic, highly patient, one-on-one nurturing to each and every student. And I think teachers would love to do that, but there just isn't enough of them and there isn't enough money in the world to pay them. And I think when you have that combined with a world that no longer needs regurgitators and team players because the AI will take over that part.
The world will always need team players, Chris.
Well, I think the greatest opportunity moving forward will be for adaptable, creative
team players.
First principles thinkers. And what is needed from education is going to change, and the way education works is going to change. And everything else will change. Material science and politics and war and everything. If this AI trajectory continues to play out as it might play out.
I mean, it's interesting, but I guess I'm a techno optimist, but slightly less than you, Chris. Like, there's something a little bit also dystopian about the idea of each child being individually nurtured by an AI teacher. It's very, very solipsistic, very isolating humans from fellow humans. And, an important role of schooling, we mustn't forget, is to socialize people. And AI cannot substitute for other people. So I think there are some really interesting questions. We're not teachers. It's hard, but I would say education, to the extent that education has improved and adapted over the last 50 years, it has not been driven by technology, nor has it made particularly effective use of technology. So that's just, one of the points I would make. And so to the extent that teaching and education continues to evolve to meet the needs of a modern society with AI in it, I'm not convinced that using AI as the tool, using technology, will actually play a major part of that evolution in education. But we'll see.
Yeah, I should say, it sounds like I'm describing them in fairly optimistic ways, and I am emphasizing the optimism. Although actually on the Reacts episode, I tend to be the most catastrophic one with the darkest vision of the future.
We're all going to die, but also AI is going to be amazing.
Yeah, I know. I know.
We all contain multitudes, Chris.
Right. I do tend to see the extremes of these things, but I'm not actually passing judgment on the idea that every student will have their own teacher or tutor. I'm just saying that feels like a natural and obvious consequence. I must say, I've mentioned a couple times on the show, I've written this thing about unbundling, this meta trend that I think has been happening over hundreds of years, powered by technology, and the end result is hyper-personalization at runtime. AI is just another massive accelerant for hyper-personalization at runtime with a personal tutor in this case. What it has also done is create a deep isolation and polarization powered by algorithms. And I don't, in my paper on unbundling, I'm explicitly say that I'm not describing this as necessarily a positive or a negative thing. In fact, I think it has both positive and negative consequences. And I think the same is true here. Each person having their own teacher is not necessarily good or bad. There are going to be pros and cons. And I agree with you 100%, Yaniv. A huge part of education is socializing children with each other and with adults and teaching them about competence hierarchies and what it means to signal and to achieve certain results and have discipline and rigor. It is not exclusively about the content of the courses. That's an incredibly important point, and one that I'm not sure exactly how AI will play into that.
All right. So thanks to everyone who sent in questions. Great bunch of questions. Our DMs are always open. Once we get a bank of good questions, we'll record another one of these Q&A episodes. So thanks to Mark, Toby, Nishita, and Nicholas for their questions. We really enjoyed answering them, and I hope they were useful. All right, Chris. So if folks want to find you on the interwebs, where do you hide?
You can find me on all the social media at Chris Saad or at chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter, where you can subscribe to my thoughts there.
And of course, Chris, you love to help companies answer their deepest and most important questions. So if folks want to work with you on that at a deeper level, how do they get in touch?
Yeah, that's right, Yaniv. You can learn more about my work helping startups answer the most important questions over at chrissaad.com/advisory, and you can reach out to me from there.
Fabulous. Okay, fun as always, Chris. Have a good one.
All right, catch you later, mate. Bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.